In the forgotten folds of eastern Kentucky, where the hills breathe fog and the trees whisper like restless ghosts, lies a patch of forest no one dares to claim. Locals call it Calvert Hollow, though the name has long been erased from modern maps. Those who still remember it speak softly, as if the place itself might be listening. They say it's where a bloodline once buried its shame, for generations of cousin marriages, hidden away from the world, breeding something that should never have survived. It began, as all cursed stories do, with love that should have never been. A single family, isolated by poverty and pride, turned inward, generation after generation, until the line blurred between kin and lover, between child and sibling. The result was a name that disappeared from public record but lived on in whispers, the Kinleys of Calvert Hollow. When the filmmaker arrived, he didn't believe in curses. He came chasing folklore, not ghosts. The locals tried to warn him. They told him about the strange lights that glowed in the woods at night, about the cries that echoed like laughter, about the woman who wandered into town once a year to buy salt and vanish again before sunset. But he only smiled, notebook in hand, camera ready. The road to the hollow was barely a road at all, just a dirt vein cutting through endless trees. The deeper he went, the quieter the world became. No birds. No wind. Just the slow hum of his own heartbeat. When he found the house, a sagging structure half swallowed by moss and vines, it looked less like it was built and more like it had grown there. On the porch hung a family portrait, faces pale and identical, eyes too close together, smiles too wide. It began on a rainy autumn afternoon when a young filmmaker named Daniel Price drove through the winding backroads of eastern Kentucky, searching for stories forgotten by time. His passion was documenting lost folklore, tales that existed only in the whispers of old mountain towns. He had already filmed stories of coal miners' ghosts, witch trials, and the infamous blue-skinned families of Appalachia, but what drew him here was a rumor too strange to ignore, a family that had supposedly cut itself off from the world for over a century. The townspeople called them the Hollow Kin, though no one seemed to know their real name. As Daniel followed the faded map on his dashboard, he passed abandoned gas stations and boarded-up churches, each one more desolate than the last. The world seemed to fade into a sepia haze, as if time itself moved slower here. When he reached the small town of Briar Creek, population barely 200, he stopped at a rundown diner that looked like it hadn't changed since the 1950s. Inside, the air smelled of coffee and dust, and the few customers turned to stare as he entered, an outsider carrying a camera case and a stack of notebooks. He asked the waitress if she'd ever heard of the Hollow Kin, and her hand froze mid-pour. She exchanged glances with an old man sitting by the window, his face lined like cracked leather. Finally, she said in a low voice, "You don't want to go up there, son. Some things in them woods ain't meant to be found." Her words only deepened Daniel's curiosity. He pressed for more, but the conversation died as quickly as it began. The old man muttered something about the family in the trees, and the blood that turned wrong, before leaving a few crumpled bills on the counter and disappearing into the mist outside. Daniel noted every word. To him, this wasn't a warning, it was an invitation. That night, he checked into a roadside motel, the kind with flickering neon lights and carpets that smelled of mildew. He spent hours going through local archives, scrolling through digital scans of newspapers so old the ink had nearly vanished. In one yellowed clipping from 1942, he found a headline that caught his breath, *, Kinley family refuses evacuation order, will die on our land, says patriarch. It was the first real trace of the people the town tried to forget. He didn't know it yet, but that headline would be the first step down a path that would consume him completely. The next morning, Daniel woke before dawn, the fog outside his motel window so thick it looked like the world had been erased. He packed his camera gear and loaded his truck, still thinking about the name he had read the night before, Kinley. It echoed in his mind like a faint bell, something both human and wrong. Following the old highway toward the hills, he soon noticed how quickly the signs of civilization faded. Houses grew farther apart, roads cracked and narrowed, and even the birds seemed to vanish as he climbed deeper into the Appalachian backcountry. When he finally reached the outskirts of Calvert Hollow, the road turned to gravel, and a wooden sign stood crooked at the bend. The words had long been washed away by rain, but carved faintly into the wood were two letters, K and L. He didn't know whether to take it as confirmation or coincidence. At the base of the hollow sat a small general store, barely standing, its porch littered with empty bottles and rusted tools. Inside, two men sat playing cards by a dusty window. When Daniel entered, the air grew still. The man behind the counter, a heavy-set fellow with gray stubble and watchful eyes, asked what brought him this far into the dark. Daniel smiled politely and explained that he was making a documentary about forgotten families of the Appalachian Mountains. The man's expression hardened at once. "You're lookin' for them Kinleys, ain't ya?" he said flatly. Daniel hesitated, but his silence was enough of an answer. The older man stood up slowly and pointed toward the forest behind the store. "Don't go in them woods, boy. Folks don't come back the same. Some don't come back at all." Daniel tried to ask why, but the man's tone shifted from warning to something closer to pity. "Ain't nothin' natural lives out there no more," he said quietly. "Not man, not beast." The younger card player chuckled nervously, muttering that the last person who went searching for the Kinleys was found 3 weeks later, eyes open and lungs full of mud, as if the ground itself had swallowed him alive. Daniel forced a laugh, pretending not to believe a word, but his pulse quickened. The forest beyond the store stretched endlessly, trees packed so tightly together they formed a wall of shadow. He stepped outside and stared at that wall for a long moment, camera hanging loosely at his side. The air smelled of rain and something faintly metallic, like rust or blood. The warnings from the locals should have turned him back, but instead, they only convinced him more that he was standing on the edge of something the world had tried to bury. That night, Daniel sat in his motel room surrounded by stacks of yellowed newspapers, brittle as autumn leaves. The locals' warnings still echoed in his head, but curiosity burned hotter than fear. He had always believed that truth hides in the places people are too afraid to look, and the Kinley family seemed to be one of those buried truths. Hours passed as he combed through old archives, scrolling through reels of microfilm and faded county records that hadn't been touched in decades. Then, buried between articles about harvest festivals and coal mine accidents, he found it, a headline from October 1927 that read, "4 generations of cousin marriages in Calvert Hollow, a family that forgot the world." The article was short but chilling. It described how the Kinleys, once a small farming family, had slowly withdrawn from society after the Civil War. They stopped attending church, stopped sending their children to school, and eventually stopped speaking to anyone outside their bloodline. Over the years, their isolation grew into something darker. The reporter claimed that by the 4th generation, the children were born frail and sickly, with strange deformities and faces that all looked eerily alike. The county tried to intervene once, but after a government officer disappeared during a routine welfare check, no one dared go back. Daniel read the lines over and over, feeling the weight of every word pressing into his chest. He noticed a name at the end of the article, Edwin Harlow, County Reporter Star. He searched for Harlow's other work, only to find that his byline vanished after that single story. It was as if the reporter himself had disappeared. The deeper Daniel dug, the stranger things became. A property map from 1951 showed Calvert Hollow listed as uninhabited, but scrawled in pencil next to it was a note, "Family still present, do not enter without escort." Another record mentioned a federal survey team that visited the area in the 1960s, only to report unusual resistance from residents. No photographs, no follow-up, just silence. Daniel leaned back in his chair, the motel clock ticking loud in the quiet room. His reflection in the window looked pale and haunted in the dim light. Outside, the fog rolled over the hills like breath from something sleeping. He realized he wasn't chasing a myth anymore, he was chasing a bloodline deliberately erased from history. As the rain began to tap against the glass, he felt a thrill of discovery mixed with something heavier, a creeping sense that the past hadn't been buried, it had simply been waiting. The following day, Daniel drove out before sunrise, his headlights cutting through the mist as he followed the last marked trail leading into Calvert Hollow. The road soon dissolved into a dirt path lined with towering trees that seemed to lean inward, swallowing the light. He parked his truck at the edge of the woods, where an old fence, half-rotted and covered in moss, marked the boundary of what used to be Kinley property. The forest was unnervingly quiet. Not a single bird called, not even the hum of insects. It felt like stepping into a place the earth had forgotten. Daniel switched on his camera, the lens fogging slightly in the damp air, and began to walk deeper into the woods. The ground was soft underfoot, carpeted with leaves that had turned black with age. Every few minutes he stopped to take footage, trees twisted into unnatural shapes, remnants of rusted farm tools swallowed by roots, the skeletal remains of what might once have been a barn. As the sun began to dip behind the mountains, the woods grew darker, the air heavier. It was then that he noticed something strange, faint flickers of light in the distance, like fireflies but too steady, too deliberate. They pulsed softly, deep between the trees, far from any sign of habitation. Daniel hesitated for a moment, then followed them. The deeper he went, the colder it became. The forest floor sloped downward into a shallow ravine, and there, half hidden beneath a tangle of vines and branches, he saw it, an old farmhouse standing crooked, its roof caved in on one side, the wood blackened by time. The windows were boarded shut, yet through the cracks, the same faint light glimmered from within. Daniel raised his camera, zooming in on the house. Every instinct told him to turn back, but the part of him that had spent years chasing forgotten legends pushed him forward. As he stepped onto the porch, the boards groaned beneath his boots. The air smelled of rot and something metallic, something that reminded him of blood. The door was slightly ajar, and when he pushed it open, it let out a long, hollow creak that echoed through the house. Inside, dust floated in the beam of his flashlight. Furniture sat where it had been left decades ago, draped in cobwebs, frozen in decay. On the far wall hung photographs, dozens of them, each in a cracked wooden frame. Faces stared back at him, all eerily similar, their eyes almost identical, their features repeating over and over through the years. Daniel felt a chill crawl down his spine as he realized the lights hadn't been reflections. Someone, or something, had turned them on. Daniel's breath fogged in the stale air as he stepped farther into the house, the floorboards moaning beneath his weight. The flashlight beam trembled slightly in his hand, casting moving shadows across the walls lined with framed photographs. Each image was worn, the glass cracked and fogged with age, but the faces were still clear enough to see, and that was what made his stomach tighten. The people in the photos looked almost identical, their pale complexions and wide-set eyes repeating like a haunting pattern through the decades. The men all shared the same jawline, the same unsettling smile, and the women, though dressed in different eras of clothing, seemed to share one expression, a hollow, knowing gaze that followed him wherever he moved. It was as though the family had been endlessly copying itself, generation after generation, their bloodline looping in on itself. He ran his camera across the wall, capturing every detail. The oldest photo, dated 1889, showed a man and woman standing on the same porch he'd just walked across. Behind them, the forest was thinner, the land still alive. But in the more recent pictures, those from the 1960s and onward, the same background appeared darker, the trees thicker, almost pressing against the house like a living cage. The last photo, undated and colorized, showed a family of 5. Their faces were distorted, not by damage, but by birth. The eyes too close together, the skin pale and stretched. The father and eldest son could have been twins, and the daughters bore such uncanny resemblance it was impossible to tell them apart. A sudden creak came from the upper floor. Daniel froze, his flashlight jerking toward the staircase. Dust drifted down from the ceiling, followed by another sound, faint, slow, deliberate footsteps. He held his breath, every nerve in his body urging him to run, but his curiosity anchored him to the floor. He whispered a cautious greeting, but there was no answer, only silence so thick it felt alive. He raised his camera again, turning slowly to capture more of the room, when he noticed something he hadn't before. On the table near the photograph sat an open family Bible, its pages brittle and yellowed. Written in careful ink beneath each birth record was the same surname repeated over and over, Kinley, until the ink bled together into one dark stain. The realization hit him hard. The identical faces, the repeated names, the secrecy, it all pointed to one horrifying truth. This wasn't just a family tree, it was a loop that had twisted back on itself for generations. As he backed toward the door, something upstairs shifted again, heavier this time, followed by the unmistakable sound of a slow, dragging breath. Daniel stood frozen, staring up the staircase, the beam of his flashlight trembling in his grip. The sound above him grew clearer, a slow shuffling, like bare feet dragging across old wood. His instincts screamed at him to leave, but something else, a stubborn need for truth, kept him rooted to the spot. After a few tense seconds, he called out, asking if anyone was there. The noise stopped. Silence swallowed the house again, broken only by the ticking of something unseen, perhaps an old clock still clinging to life. Then, from the top of the stairs, a woman's voice answered, faint and trembling, as though coming from another time. "You shouldn't be here." Daniel's heart pounded. He aimed his flashlight upward, and there she was, an elderly woman standing in the shadows, her thin frame draped in a faded housecoat that might once have been white. Her hair hung long and silver, her face pale but strangely ageless, her eyes reflecting the light like wet glass. She gripped the banister as she descended slowly, each step creaking like the house itself was protesting her movement. When she reached the bottom, Daniel saw that her hands were marked with deep veins, her nails yellowed, yet her posture carried a certain quiet strength. "Are you one of the Kinleys?" he asked softly. She hesitated before nodding once. "I'm the last," she said. The hollow took the rest. Her voice was calm, almost rehearsed, as if she had been waiting years to speak those words. Daniel lowered his camera slightly, realizing he might have stumbled upon something no one else alive had ever witnessed. The woman motioned for him to follow her into the parlor, where a small fire smoldered weakly in an old iron stove. Despite the decay around them, the fire was fresh, the logs still crackling. Someone had been here, living in this forgotten ruin. As she sat in a worn armchair, the woman began to speak, her eyes fixed on the flames. She told Daniel that her name was Eliza Kinley, and that her family had lived in Calvert Hollow for more than 100 years without ever leaving. "It was the way of our blood," she said quietly. "We kept it pure. That's what they told us." Her tone carried both pride and sorrow, a mixture that unsettled Daniel. She spoke of children born with strange afflictions, of nights filled with cries that echoed through the hills, of a curse that was said to have begun when her great-grandfather married his own cousin. As Daniel listened, recording every word, he began to notice something in her expression, a flicker of madness, or perhaps memory, that made him realize the horror of her isolation was far from over. Eliza's voice wavered as the firelight danced across her sunken face, her words carrying the weight of generations steeped in sorrow and secrecy. She spoke of her family's devotion to the old ways, how their ancestors believed that keeping their bloodline pure would preserve their strength, their land, and their name. "It began with pride," she said, "a foolish sense of legacy passed from father to son, from mother to daughter. They thought God smiled on it," she whispered, her eyes distant. But he didn't. He watched. And he waited. The air in the room felt heavier with every word, as though the house itself absorbed her confession. Daniel leaned closer, his camera recording the crackle of the fire and the faint tremor in her tone. She described how, over time, the Kinleys began to change. Children were born weaker, smaller, their eyes set deep in their faces, their skin pale as candle wax. Some couldn't speak, others barely walked, yet the family refused to admit that something had gone terribly wrong. The elders called it God's testing, a divine punishment for those who strayed from the family's path. Eliza's mother, she said, used to whisper prayers over her crib, not to ask for healing but for forgiveness, for the sins carried in their very blood. Each child was a reminder, Eliza murmured, that the blood remembers what it should have forgotten. Daniel could hear the despair buried beneath her calmness. She told him that as the years went on, the Kinleys' isolation deepened. They stopped attending the small church in Briar Creek after a preacher called them the cursed. When outsiders came offering help or medicine, the men of the family would chase them away, sometimes violently. The woods became their only refuge, and soon even that turned against them. Strange things began happening in the hollow, lights in the trees, animals born twisted and wrong, storms that seemed to hover only above their land. The family believed they were being punished, that God had sealed them away from the rest of the world as retribution. Eliza's hands shook as she spoke of her siblings, 3 brothers and a sister, all born with frailties that worsened with time. One by one they died before reaching adulthood, their graves marked only by wooden crosses behind the house. She alone survived, and for reasons she didn't understand, the curse had spared her body, though not her mind. "I hear them sometimes," she said softly, her eyes glistening. "In the trees, in the walls. They don't forgive us. They never left." Daniel sat still, realizing this wasn't just a story of genetic decay, it was a legacy of guilt carved into the bones of an entire family. The fire in the stove hissed as a log cracked, sending up a shower of sparks that briefly illuminated Eliza's face. Her expression had changed, the calmness that once anchored her words was dissolving into something fractured. She stared past Daniel, her eyes unfocused, as though she could see things he could not. He asked her softly when she last saw another living member of her family, but she didn't seem to hear him. Instead, she began to mutter to herself, her lips trembling. "The blood never dies," she whispered, again and again, each repetition heavier than the last. The tone of her voice shifted, first sorrowful, then almost reverent, and finally, fearful. Daniel lowered his camera for a moment, uncertain whether to comfort her or to keep filming. When she finally looked at him, her eyes glistened in the dim light, reflecting both the flames and something wild beneath the surface. "You shouldn't have come here," she said suddenly, her voice sharp and brittle. "They don't like strangers in the house." Daniel glanced around the room, his pulse quickening. The way she said they made his skin crawl. He tried to remind her that the rest of her family was gone, buried years ago in the woods outside, but she shook her head violently. "No," she hissed, clutching the armrest of her chair. "They don't die. Not really. The blood keeps them. It keeps everything." Her breathing grew shallow, her frail frame trembling as if an unseen force pressed against her. Daniel tried to steady her, asking what she meant, but she seemed to slip deeper into a trance. Her gaze fixed on a dark corner of the room, where the shadows seemed to pulse faintly. "They're watching," she said. "They always watch when someone new comes. The Hollow remembers." A sudden gust swept through the broken windows, snuffing the fire almost completely, plunging the room into near darkness. Daniel's flashlight flickered, and for a moment he thought he saw movement at the edge of its beam, a figure, or perhaps just the outline of one, retreating into the hall. Eliza began to laugh, a dry, brittle sound that cracked in her throat. "You hear it now, don't you?" she said. "The blood calls. It calls everyone back." Her laughter faded into soft weeping, her head bowing as she rocked gently in her chair. Daniel felt the weight of something unseen pressing around him, thick and suffocating. The air in the room seemed to hum, vibrating faintly against his chest. He turned off his camera, thinking it might calm her, but the moment the red light went dark, Eliza's eyes snapped up, and she whispered in a voice that didn't sound like her own, "Now they know you're here." The storm rolled in not long after midnight, heavy rain hammering against the roof and wind howling through the broken windows like a chorus of lost voices. Daniel stayed awake long after Eliza had fallen silent, her frail body slumped in the armchair, eyes closed but never quite at peace. He wanted to leave, to flee the suffocating darkness of the Hollow, but something deep inside him insisted he had come too far to turn back. He had to see the truth with his own eyes, to understand what lay beneath all the whispers and warnings. As lightning flashed across the forest outside, he caught sight of something through the window, a line of shapes standing just beyond the tree line. For a moment, he thought they were shadows, but when the next flash came, he saw they were crosses, dozens of them, marking graves. He stepped outside into the downpour, the mud sucking at his boots as he crossed the yard. The air was cold and heavy, carrying the scent of wet soil and decay. The graves were crude, each one marked with a wooden cross carved by hand. Names had been etched into the wood, but time had blurred most of them into illegibility. Only one word remained clear across nearly every marker, *Kinley*. Some of the graves looked ancient, nearly consumed by moss, but others were fresh, the soil still dark and loose. One stood apart from the rest, newly dug, the mound unmarked and waiting. Daniel knelt beside it, tracing the edge of the pit with trembling fingers. The thought struck him that Eliza had said she was the last of her family, so whose grave was this meant to be? A distant noise echoed through the trees, a soft, dragging sound, followed by what could only be described as a breath. Daniel turned his flashlight toward the forest, but the beam struggled to cut through the rain. The light caught something glinting between the trunks, metal, perhaps, or eyes. His heart pounded as he backed toward the house, his shoes slipping in the mud. Then, just as he reached the porch, he saw it, a trail of footprints leading away from the fresh grave and back toward the house. They were small, bare, and too recent to have been left long ago. When Daniel stepped back inside, the armchair was empty. The fire was out, the air colder than before. Eliza was gone, though her voice seemed to linger, whispering faintly from the walls, repeating the same words he had heard earlier, "The blood never dies." The camera on the table was still recording, the red light blinking in the dark, but Daniel could no longer see what it was capturing behind him. Morning came, but the storm never truly passed. The sky above Calvert Hollow was a dull, colorless gray, the kind that made it impossible to tell the hour. The forest steamed faintly from the night's rain, and the air was thick with the scent of wet earth. Down by the edge of the woods, a search team from Briar Creek moved slowly through the mud, their voices low and cautious. Someone had reported a truck abandoned near the old Kinley property, its doors open, headlights dead. Inside they found Daniel's notebook soaked through, pages smeared but still legible enough to tell where he had gone. There were no signs of a struggle, no footprints beyond the yard, just the eerie quiet that seemed to swallow every sound. When the deputies reached the porch, they found the front door hanging open, creaking gently with the wind. The interior looked untouched at first glance, yet something about it felt wrong. The air was heavy, sour, almost metallic. They moved from room to room, flashlights cutting through the dust. In the parlor, they found the camera still running, its red light blinking faintly. The screen showed the final few minutes of footage Daniel had recorded. He was standing near the window, whispering to himself about the graves, his voice barely audible over the rain. Then the camera shook, as though he had turned suddenly toward a sound behind him. There was a flash of movement, a blur of pale skin and long hair, and then nothing but static. One of the deputies turned the camera off, visibly shaken. Another pointed to something scratched into the wooden floorboards beside the cold stove. The letters were carved roughly, as if in haste, "The blood remembers." They searched the rest of the house and found nothing, no signs of Eliza Kinley, no body, no traces of anyone alive or dead. But behind the house, beyond the line of old graves, they discovered something new. The fresh mound Daniel had seen was no longer untouched. The soil was disturbed, clawed open from within, and at its center lay Daniel's microphone and one of his gloves, both caked in mud. By afternoon, the team retreated, claiming the area unsafe due to the unstable ground. The report filed later simply read, "Missing person, presumed deceased." But the footage never left the evidence room. Deputies swore they could hear something beneath the static when they played it back late at night, soft breathing, and a woman's voice whispering close to the microphone, repeating the same words over and over, quiet and certain, "The hollow keeps its own."